It's episode 199 of the Author Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Today's episode is sponsored by Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 16 is out of Tales of the Canyons of the Damned. It consists of 5 sharp, suspenseful, and thought-provoking short time travel-themed stories, each from a different featured master of speculative fiction. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, Dominion Rising. If you listened to last week's episode, you can really delve into what this giant 23 all-original science fiction epic fantasy novel box set is all about. It's on pre-sale right now for only 99 cents. Dominion Rising, nearly 8,000 pages and over 1 million words in total. Go pick it up today. A link in the show notes. Also, Galactic Satori Chronicles by Paul E. Hicks and Breaker. Galactic Satori Chronicles brings you a thirst for revenge, which sends man on a deadly journey through the galaxy in the adrenaline-pumping new novel Galactic Satori Chronicles. There's 2 out now. Book 1 is Earth and Book 2 is Kron. They carry the Author Stories seal of approval. I'd also like to thank my good friend Ed Gosney for sponsoring the show. Ed's blog, Cool Comics in My Collection, is a must-read for me every single week. You can find it at edgosney.com. Ed's also a fantastic writer, and if you're looking for a great beach read, also click on his link in the show notes where you can land on his Amazon page and pick up one of his novels. Also, at the end of the show, we're going to have a clip from Richard Gleaves' Jason Crane series. You'll want to stick around for that. Before we get into our interview today, we're going to have a short word from Amy Hale about her new book series, The Shadows Trilogy. Hey, I have a new story out. A supervillain anthology, World Domination, dropped yesterday, and it also has a companion anthology. It's a bird, it's a plane, it's a superhero anthology. We dropped both of these books at the same time. Steve Bowyer, you might remember him from a few episodes back, put these together. Phenomenal stories by phenomenal writers. Pick them both up. You can get both of them for $1.98. They're only 99 cents each for this introductory offer. There's a link in the show notes. Episode 200 is the very next episode. This Friday, I've got a very special guest. I'll be talking about that online soon. Thank you for sticking with me for 200 episodes. I really appreciate it.
The Shadows Trilogy from Amy Hale. All 3 books are now available on all ebook platforms as well as paperback. Colt Henderson is a man who lives for the moment. His past has taught him that life is unpredictable and often disappointing. A confirmed bachelor, he believes that love only exists in fairy tales. She's lost, scared, and can't remember a thing about her past or her identity. She senses all is not as it should be, but without her memory, how does she know what to fear and what to trust? Because of her status as a Jane Doe, she names herself Jane and works to put her life back together. In the process, she learns that she possesses unique abilities that certain people will kill for. Fate throws Colt and Jane together, but they both have a lot to learn about forgiveness and acceptance. Colt's determination and Jane's remarkable gifts will send them on a journey that they never expected. To survive, they will need each other, but sometimes facts are scarier than fiction, and the truth is better left unknown. The Shadows Trilogy by Amy Hale. Pick up the entire trilogy today.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Amor Towles on the show with me. He has a book that's been out since September, but is still just burning up the charts. It's called A Gentleman in Moscow, and it's a great pleasure to have you on the show, Amor.
Thanks, Hank. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have you. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I think it's quite vivid in the sense that I began writing in first grade. My first grade teacher, Mrs. Gom, was about 60 years old and was close friends with a local poet by the name of David McCord. And she invited him. He was a published juvenile poet, poems for children. Not quite in the manner of Dr. Seuss, but of a similar style. And he came and visited our class, read his poems, and I remember going home that night and thinking, that was so cool. Seeing him, seeing the poems. I bought 2 of his books we'd been given money to do so, and I started writing poems that night. I mean, copying him in essence. But that began this sort of parallel process that has lasted throughout my life, which is write a little, read a little, write a little, read a little. I'm 52 now, but basically I read everything with a pen in hand, and over the course of my life, what I have read has influenced what I wanted to write, how I write, what I've learned from the craft comes from that ongoing back and forth process.
I love that. When you say that you read with a pen in hand, what sorts of things usually kind of jump out at you and you are taking notes about?
It's sort of I'm very often underlining on the technical end. Of course, I'm underlining a passage that seems particularly wise or well put or as a thematic import. I certainly am doing that, like I think any of us would. But in addition to that, one of the things that I like to do when I read is track motifs. So if I gain a sense early in the novel that I'll sort of run across the second time a character has looked through a window, let's say, and it sort of strikes me that's interesting. That character A in this scene was kind of gazing out the window, and it happens again 70 pages later with a character in a different room. And I'll underline it, but then I'll go back and find the first instance. I'll mark in the column of my book, or in the margin, the page numbers of the two. So if you went to one, you could find the page number referencing the other. And then over the course of the book, I will keep finding more of those often, where it's, another character in front of a window, or it's someone looking through a store window, or it's someone in a doorway, or it's a piece of glass, gets smashed. And I start to sync those up. And so that, if I go back to the original instance, on that page are 8 page numbers now that somehow tie to this. And I don't always know what it means initially. Yeah. So that's the nature of an effective motif. And often, and I know this from my own work, when an author is in the zone, as it were, and has edited the book to sort of a feel that everything feels just right and is organic, they don't always know when a particular image has recurred over the course of the book, and that's great. It's a part of the unconscious aspect of the artist. But if you start to dwell, or if I will start to dwell towards the end of the book on what does this mean, and if a motif like that in fact exists in a book with a reasonable consistency in a variety of ways, it probably is pointing to a central theme, of longing in this case, or of dreaming, or of the separation between, sort of the interior life of characters and the external life that they live in the town, or with their parents, or, or the women from the men, or whatever it is. This sort of recurrence of the window is going to end up meaning something. I can almost guarantee it. And so I hunt for those. I had the pleasure a week ago of interviewing Elizabeth Strout, the Pulitzer Prize-winning writer of Olive Kitteridge. She was speaking about her new book, which is great. Anything is possible here in New York. And I was asked to interview her for the audience and as a part of that night. And one of my questions was, in Anything is Possible, it seemed that across these series of stories, that one character reaching out and touching another character on the hand or the forearm ended up being this recurring physical act of great emotional import throughout the series of stories, stories are unrelated. They're about different people. But in many of the stories, a critical moment occurs between the character and not an intimate member of their family or of their friends or of their professional life, but sort of a brief encounter with a stranger. Maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a student who they have an occasional engagement with. It's literally a stranger who has stopped, they've met in an inn. And the conversation between them suddenly surfaces something which is emotionally intense, and one character to the other may just reach out and touch the hand of the other character, and which in a way is so much more powerful than a hug or a kiss, or even hitting someone with their fist. And it's so appropriate to this incredibly intense moment between two people who don't know each other intimately. How do you bridge that gap, and yet it's full of humanity? So I had tracked all of these, and as I said, Elizabeth, I'm interested in this, Liz, about this, and she kind of looked at me in shock, and she said, it's so interesting. And she goes, I remember vividly writing, I think it was in Olive Kittredge, where Olive touches somebody on the hand, and it meant a lot to Liz. And she's like, I had no notion of it in this book at all, but there are at least 6 instances of it, So yes, I hunt that, and I guess the only other thing, and I've gone on too long about this perhaps, but it is I'm very interested in structure. I think in how does this work? You read a book by Joseph Conrad, or you're reading a work of Marquez, and you've enjoyed it. It's powerful. It's you can tell it's a great novel, but there's this sort of question of how does it work? How is it constructed? And there's very valuable time can be spent in thinking about what excuse me, what are the length of the chapters? What is the are we moving? How does that relate to the passage of time, to the geography of this narrative? Are you moving closer and closer to a center as you go through the whole thing? Or are you going in and coming back out? Is it cyclical? Or is it a whole series of short passages that somehow tie together? I'm very interested in investigating that. So as I get deeper into a book, I will often back up and start to try to, now that I've read 2/3 of it, I understand aspects of it, to really try to pin down what is happening under the surface of the book structurally. Because, again, it's a mechanism for understanding how the book works, and it's also illuminating for me in terms of my craft.
Sure. And I love that you study those motifs, because that's something I also tend to notice a lot. And like you said, I think a lot of times it is a subconscious thing on the part of the writer. But when you're tracking down those motifs and seeing how they work together and looking for the thing that those things might reveal, what do you think that does for your writing, to study these things that sometimes subconsciously come out in another writer's work?
I guess it's not as if I then in my next story say, okay, I'm going to pick,
of course,
oranges are going to be my motif, and I'm going to follow those, through. I'm going to hide them in 7 parts of the book, because I don't think that works as effectively as
no, absolutely not.
Yes, trusting in your imagination and the poetry of language. And I actually, on my website for both books, Rules of Civility and Gentlemen of Moscow, there's a reader's guide for both books that I wrote, and in both, as one of the questions, I talk about this issue, but I actually list 3 motifs or 4 motifs in each book that I did not notice until at the end. When I was going back editing the whole thing, and you're sort of like, oh, well, God, that's odd. That's the 3rd time I've referenced a sinking ship, in essence, or some version of that. And that's a real example in that. In A Gentleman in Moscow, as an example, Robinson Crusoe is mentioned early on as sort of a version of a person who's trapped and must make the best of his circumstances, and the Countess sort of, well, I'm going to live like that. Much later, Ulysses comes up, who is, obviously washed ashore in his own fashion, and there are other versions of shipwrecks that sort of surfaced. And so, as I say, going through, editing the book, sentence by sentence, as a part of the publishing process, I was sort of like, God, that's the 4th time. That's so odd. So I value the ones that are unconscious most of all. But so going back to your question, what does it do for me? And I think it's like, it goes back to this idea of why do physicians early on in their careers dissect human bodies? Why is that such an essential part of the tradition of medical science? Well, we understand that, right? It's cutting open the body and seeing where the parts are and their shapes and how they're interconnected, and is so you can almost visualize, when you're dealing with a living person who has a symptom, what might be going on under the surface. That's a critical part of it, and so this is a version of that for me. This is by investigating layers of themes and images, and having I get closer and closer to the book that I've enjoyed. And that, I think, just makes me stronger as a writer, in that I have more facility with the way that words, images, and themes potentially interrelate. Much as I say, the physician cuts open the body, and that's helpful later.
That's fantastic. I I definitely picked up on that motif in A Gentleman in Moscow of shipwrecked. I mean, it's almost like A Gentleman in Moscow is a shipwrecked tale of sorts.
Right.
And I want to get to that in just a minute. But before we get that far down the path of your writing career, you went to Yale and got your MA in English from Stanford. And then in 1989, your short story, The Temptations of Pleasure, was published in the Paris Review. That was 1989. Then your first book, Rules of Civility, was published in 2011. What happened in those intervening years?
Well, I was, when the Paris Review piece was published, I was 25 roughly and living in New York, and I needed work, and so I joined a friend of mine who had started an investment firm, and 21 years later, we were still working side by side. So, so over the course of that 20 years, the first 10 years on the job, I stopped writing for really the first time in memory. Having started, as I say, in first grade, and 10 years later, after the firm, we got to the point where it was thriving and it was beginning to grow both in terms of clients and colleagues and et cetera. We had kind of mastered our craft in that arena. Then I began writing again in my mid-30s. And I spent 7 years writing a book that I didn't like, and I set that aside, and then I studied that failure, as it were, and then I went back to work, and Rules of Civility came out of that second effort, a totally different book, and that was then published, and then I retired from the firm shortly before starting A Gentleman in Moscow.
Those dry desert years in a writer's life are sometimes as fascinating as the time spent working on the thing that becomes kind of your masterpiece or the thing you're most proud of. That's to have been so enamored with writing and something that you knew that you wanted to do from such a young age, and then to have a 10-year spell where you don't write at all and you're busy pursuing other things. What that brought you back to wanting to write a book and explore that creative side that you had kept on the shelf for a while?
Well, it was, certainly the desire to do it is a major part, but in all honesty, I think influence was fear. So fear rather than desire, because I knew I stopped writing and was focusing on the firm, and in my late 20s, being a novelist was what I'd always wanted to do in my life. And I'm told by Matheson was a great mentor of mine, a great naturalist and novelist years ago. And while at Yale, he visited. I took a seminar with him, and then I ended up writing independently with him after that. He was a person. Listen, you're very talented at this. This is no joke. And but you don't. That's the first impression of a professional on the outside who I admire. And confirmed that from his that I stopped writing to go into Wall Street. He was furious in a great way, and he was like, "I can't believe you're doing it," because you should just know that when you go and take that job, I've seen other people do it. They never come back. Tell yourself that you're going to write a book, but you're done. And I think you're making a big mistake. So that hung over me. And so, as I say, my fear was that 50 and I'd never gone back to it. I really would feel the bitterness of one who had never their dream, despite an external indication that I had talent. So and the deed to do it. But we know a lot of times we don't end up doing what we do or what we can do, and because we end up in life. So that was sort of the fear, and I kind of knew I got to get back into this. Now, once I got back into it, then the old desire part got to take over fully again. Once I was writing again on a steady basis, even while I was writing the book that I didn't like, I ceased to have the fear, because I was like, oh, you know what? I love this, and I know I can do this, and I am just gonna do it. And even with the job or with wife, with kids, I'm just gonna keep doing it. And that was very satisfying to come out on the other side of that.
Sure. During that time when you were not writing, were you still an avid reader?
Yes, sir.
What sorts of things really kind of captured your imagination, and did you gravitate toward?
I read a lot, and I read broadly. Although I spend most of my time reading authors who are dead, I guess. I I think that time is not very good at preserving all that is great in art. It is not good at that. However, time is very good at eliminating all that is mediocre in art. So, there are many 19th century novels that are extraordinary that we will never read. They've disappeared. They're out of print. No one knows they were written. They're gone for good. But those 19th century novels that still survive in the public, sort of consciousness, I can almost guarantee you are worthy of a reader's consideration, because the mediocre stuff is just gone. So as a result, with someone who's got limited time and a love of literature, I trust in time to bring me to books that are rich, layered, impactful, well done, interesting, all the above. And so most of my reading is books that were written between 1800 and 1950. But then I read very widely. I love the 19th century Russians. I love the 19th century British novels. I love the great early American 20th century novelists. I love the magical realists from Latin America. I love the avant-gardists, from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. I have broad interests.
As a writer, how important is it for a writer to read things outside of their current writing interest? Like if a person is writing within a particular genre, is it important for them to get outside that genre to get other influences and maybe look at the way other storytellers approach the craft?
I think it's a very personal question in a way, and every writer is going to approach that differently. But for me personally, if I was writing in a particular genre, I would avoid reading that genre at all costs. I think that the influence of reading someone you admire while you're about to go do the same thing in too close proximity is very fraught. You run the risk of copying that person too much. You run the risk of second guessing your own instincts. You run the risk into falling into formula. There's a lot of risks associated with that, I think. So for me, I really avoid reading things that are within the sphere of what I'm doing. I say that's particularly dangerous, I think, in the genre field. It's great to know the genre if you're going to read genre or know what you like, but you want to have bury that and let it lie for a while, I think, before you go and start trying to invent your own work. I am not a believer in the write what you know thing. I think that's is an absolutely over-prescribed piece of advice to young writers, and in a way is the bane of creative writing in the last 30 years, because it's what we've got is plenty of generations of young writers who are writing about their personal romances or their parents' divorces or their life in Brooklyn or whatever. And I think that young writers, maybe not all, but many young writers would be better served by constantly writing what they don't know, and reading what they don't know along the same lines, which is experimenting, trying different styles, different voices, different types of characters, different narrative structures, different, everything. Just, constantly trying something different on all facets as a means of refining their craft. And then they can kind of circle in on projects that are personally important to them, whether or not the events happen to them or not. But meaning that you can kind of try to get to a style and a voice that seems to resonate with themselves internally, because then that can be a powerful thing in itself.
Sure. And getting outside of your personal comfort and outside of the things that you absolutely know allows you to use imagination, which is what we all set out to do, I think.
Well, yes, absolutely, and it allows you to learn empathy. It allows you to it allows you to explore different frames of consciousness. I think if you look at most of the time when a reader comes to me and says, "I love this sentence. This was so wise. I underlined it. I wrote it down. Whatever." When that happens, almost always that sentence is something that I never would have come up with in my own life. That is something which writing about a different person with that person's own background and their own psychology, their own sort of sentiments, and then that who's not me, imagining that person, living that through that person for a moment, and then putting that person in a circumstance that I have never been in. That's what generates that moment of wisdom, is that person in that situation suddenly says, people are blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, God, that's great. Of course, what a insightful thing to say, or how hilarious, or whatever it is. That it is the transposing of oneself into that situation that allows for that insight. And so, yeah, I think that's you're crazy not to allow yourself to experience that as a writer.
You said that you spent 7 years on a book that you didn't like. I think in today's climate, especially, writers are encouraged to publish quickly, publish often, and keep the mill churning, if you will. 7 years is a long time to work on a book that you've never published. Can you tell us anything about that project and maybe kind of what you were going through at the time?
No, I don't want to dwell on that. I don't think we need to dwell on that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was fine. There was a lot of things about it that were fine. And, it wasn't like I didn't know how to write at that time. It wasn't like the material wasn't interesting. It just didn't work, and I think the biggest thing about it is that I did not outline it very carefully. And given what I'd like to try to achieve in a novel, outlining is very advantageous to me because I do want to see the entire thing sort of and have it be cohesive, have motifs that resonate, have language and themes and images that appear on page 100, 300, 500 in an important way. And it's very hard to achieve a book in that fashion if you're kind of making it up as you go along. So yes, I am, that was a learning experience that came out of that, which is that I really need to design my books in advance. And that's what I tend to do. I will design a book for a year before I write chapter one.
And there are people that are very adamant one way or the other about plotting or pantsing, as it were. And the folks that are firm, discovery writers or figuring it out as you go, will talk about kind of the magic of the story unfolding in front of them, and they're writing it down as it goes, and that having an outline stifles the creativity and doesn't allow, for things to happen spontaneously in the book. How do you, because I've read some other interviews with you and you talk about that, the happy accidents that happen during the book and characters that reveal themselves and things like that. How do you rectify those two things?
Well, I think there's, even with an outline, there's plenty of opportunity for discovery and surprise. And by the way, the outline itself is a version of that, right? Which is that it's not like the outline comes out of a machine and then you accept it and go to work. The outline itself is a process of invention and discovery and just saying, oh, no, this isn't going to happen. This is going to happen. Oh, and that actually, if that happens then I'm going to have to go back and rethink these early chapters because maybe I want to understand this aspect of that person's childhood if I'm going to talk about this later, So it's there's plenty of that playing, going on. That's in fact the majority of what the outlining process is imaginative and invention and discovery. But then once you're writing, of course, things can surface where you have an insight and say, oh, no, it's this, not that. And you might go back and I'll constantly be tinkering with the back half of the outline as I'm writing the front half of the book, because I am gaining new ideas and inspirations and a sense of how the whole thing is going to come together. But having said all that, it's still to me extremely valuable to have a sense of where I'm going. And I like a very keen sense. I like to know what every chapter is going to be about. And that again, that will evolve. But I want to know that before I start. And I guess there are you're right that there are writers who sing the praises of one process or the other. Even those, though, who do not outline. I tend to find they've got a very keen sense of where they're headed in important ways. So, yes, Dickens would tinker with his story as it unfolded, as he wrote it on a serial basis, but there's no question about it. He knew what was going to happen at the end of Great Expectations. I don't know what he's publicly said about that one way or the other. But I know genre writers who, I know that Lee Childs, we'll talk about not plotting anything for Jack Reacher's books, and that, I get that in the case of his books, because Reacher is the wire that holds it together for Childs. We knowing him, knowing how he's going to act, knowing he's going to win.
Yeah.
Basically, that gives him a lot of freedom to be like, okay, I'm gonna have him get off a bus in North Carolina, and he's gonna get arrested by mistake, and I'm gonna write that scene, and then I don't know.
Yeah.
And but all I know is that there's gonna be very bad people doing very bad things, and Jack's gonna win in the end. So yeah, he doesn't. I can see how for him there would be great pleasure and to discover as he goes, and not a lot of necessity. But, that said, we've all read novels that they start great, they seem, this great premise or great opening scene or great initial characters, and somewhere like halfway through, suddenly the thing kind of drifts, or we don't understand where it's going, or it doesn't make sense, or the characters do things that they wouldn't do, or there's a sudden event from the outside that just sort of tie things up. There's all kinds of books, novels that have very dissatisfying back thirds, and I think that's almost always because the writer has not done the work they should have done in terms of thinking more carefully about where this would go. I was at Faulkner's house. I was speaking in Oxford, Mississippi, and
just down the road from me.
Oh yeah, I forgot that. Okay, so so I went over to Faulkner's house, and he's a big hero of mine, and you may have been there, but in the room that is his office, he has the outline for his last book. I think it's his last book, is written on the walls of his office.
Right.
I mean, literally, it says chapter 1, in Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3, turning around 2 or 3 of the walls, and I think the final chapter is behind the door, You're like, wait a second, that's not how that book ends. And they say, oh no, it's behind the door, because he ran out of space. But there's no, of course, Faulkner was someone who thought very carefully about the overall structure and composition of his books, and yet, there's obviously he's an incredible sense of stream of consciousness of the sentences or paragraphs that kind of investigate these aspects of memory or of the region or of family history, and it feels like it's unfolding for him and for us and for the characters. And I'm sure to some degree, as he's writing, that was true, but that's only within the context of having a very keen sense of what the 11 parts of the book were going to be about,
Right. Your first book, Rules of Civility, came out in 2011. Was a New York Times bestseller in both hardback and paperback, and Wall Street Journal ranked it as one of the best books of 2011. Being your first published book, well, first off, where did that book come from, and what was that experience like for you in the writing and publishing?
It come from. That book is about a 25-year-old girl from a working-class background of Russian descent, living, raised in Brighton Beach in New York in 1938, which is to say it's got nothing to do with me. Nothing. There's not one aspect of that which fits my biography. So, for me, it's always, I start with a premise. I wander around, or I'm riding my bike, or I'm walking, or I'm driving, and over the course of my life, dating back till my teens, I'll say, maybe a guy. In that case, it was very specific. I was going through the photographs of Walker Evans that he took on the subway with a hidden camera in the late 30s. As a prologue of photographs, it states that they weren't shown until the 1960s in MoMA because he felt he'd invaded privacy of the subject on the subway that he had photographed. And I thought, God, can you imagine if somebody at MoMA in the 60s recognized one of the people in the photograph? And I was like, even better. What if they recognized the same guy in two photographs? But between photograph 1 and photograph 2, the guy had undergone such a transformation that she's the only one at the opening who can tell that's the same guy, in these pictures that are 30 years old. And that I wrote down on a 3x5 card. And then 20 years later, I wrote that book, But I've got a lot of those. And, as time goes on, I come back to one and I think more about it. I take more notes about it. The notes get richer or deeper, more intricate. And eventually I'm like, I'm definitely going to do that project. Gentleman in Moscow was the same kind of thing. It just grew out of an idea and then it just built over time with, I added to it and saw it better and understood it and eventually that's the one I'm going to do next.
You spend a lot of time in your books revising and editing, and you can tell as a reader that you pay very careful attention to sentence structure and how the paragraph structure, and then how the chapters are laid out. And you can tell that this book is crafted, not simply written. What is your kind of a 40,000 foot view of your creative process? When you begin the project, you said you start with an outline. How much time do you spend on that outline? And then when do you know that it's ready to begin writing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the description up front of how you perceive the books. I appreciate it. My outline, very often what will happen, and this is true of both of the books, Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow, in both cases, having had this little premise, guy trapped in hotel, or woman recognizes guy in photographs, at some point I say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to think about that more. In both cases, I wrote the core outline of the major events, the major characters, in about a 72-hour period. But now, having said that, in both cases, that means that's about 5 or 6 pages of notes, handwritten notes. This happens and this happens, and Eve and Katie, they meet Tinker, car crash, whatever, Anne Grandin, blah blah blah. So same thing with The Gentleman in Moscow. I kind of knew all the main characters, knew the key events in the first 72 hours in handwritten notes. I then take that, and the outlining process takes about a year, and that's a very detailed investigation of every chapter, every setting, every character, every event. I really start to take that and put it on a scaffold and then flesh out each component of the scaffold, moving things around, as I go in the outlining process to try to optimize it. And so I think it's very much like, I think the novel is probably closest in art form to the symphony. It's an extended work with movements that may have variation in tone and feeling and in composition, but there are motifs that tie it all together. And so, to build a symphony, you need to step back and think about those components and how they're going to work together, and you gain a sense of, it's going to be for me in, 5 movements, and the second movement's going to be sad, and the third is going to be, suddenly rejoiceful, or whatever it is. I kind of will think about it in those terms, and then you get down into the particulars. Okay, well, what is in this section? What are the events, and how do they serve that kind of the symphonic aspect of that? If in the course of the story, in The Gentleman in Moscow, there's 5 books. I had a very keen sense, ultimately, of what is book 1 about? What is its arc? What are its feelings? What conclusion can we draw from it? How does the Count leave that book? Same thing in book 2, same thing book 3, same book 4, and so you're taking that sense and making sure that all the events in that book serve that emotional, thematic, and artistic purpose. And then you have to be able to think about the 5 books. Do they work together on the grand scheme? So yeah, it's just that kind of organizing investigation, I guess.
What is it about Russia and Moscow that intrigues you? The Gentleman in Moscow is set within a hotel in Moscow, and then in Rules of Civility, you've got a character who's of Russian descent. What is it about that culture that really gets to you?
Yeah, and the Russian aspect of rules of civility is teeny, but it's there. You're right, and it's just because I wrote Rules of Civility in part because I love the 1920s and 30s, and since I was a kid, I've watched the movies, read the books, listened to the music, and I don't pick a topic, research it, and write a book. I pick a topic that is drawn out of my long-term fascinations, and then I invent the book from there. So Gentleman Moscow is similar in that, I fell in love as a young man with the 19th century Russian novel, and then that led to the study of the Russian avant-garde before the revolution, and then that led to, a study of the Soviet era and the readings of, Solzhenitsyn and Bulgakov and Mayakovsky and others. And so, yes, so I'm fascinated initially by the country, and I had been there in 1998, and everything I saw there just added to my fascination for some of the unique aspects of that culture and its history relative to, the culture and history of England or America, Italy, France. So with that fascination in mind, as soon as I decided, I'm going to write a book about a guy trapped in a hotel, after, within seconds, I was like, oh, maybe I'll set it in Russia. And they're like, yeah, that's it, Russia. So well, there you go. And then you move. Then all of a sudden you're going forward.
The hotel and the gentleman who is trapped in the hotel are placed in a very interesting period of time, and you really handle some tough times and tough subjects. But with this sort of whimsical, I can't even really, that's really not a great word. You've got this story that is so much more than that. And these interpersonal, happenings and these relationships and these encounters between people. And, this crazy story that happens while, kind of the world is going to hell in a handbasket outside. But you get a sense of those things while being able to escape those things at the same time. How did you kind of balance the honest reporting of what's happening at the time while, telling the story that is so much other than that?
Yeah, well, I appreciate your putting it that way. I knew from early on that the most delicate, one of the biggest challenges of the book and the most delicate challenge was how to integrate the harshest reality of the Soviet era with a individual and story that was not directly focused on the hardships of the era. I mean, the Count is an optimist. He's trapped in a luxury hotel for 30 years. He ultimately leads a very rich life there. And he doesn't see all that is bad that unfolds firsthand. And he is, by virtue of his upbringing, he's a 19th century figure. And so he is interested in and celebrates, food, wine, music, art. And so again, that's very natural to his personality. And the book is written largely from his perspective. So he wouldn't be the perfect person to critique the shortcomings of the Soviet era, or to be the direct witness of its most difficult outcomes. So partly because he's in the hotel, but you can't ignore that, nor should it be ignored. The book is not, as I say, it's not like the Google Archipelago, which is a direct investigation of the worst aspects of the Soviet life, and is an amazing book. So I knew I had to strike this balance, or this delicate balance, and one of the ways that it's dealt with is that while 90% of the book is told from the perspective of the Count, with his tone, with his knowledge, with towards his fascinations, 10%, 15% of the book is told by kind of a meta-narrator who initially shows up in footnotes. And then, shows up in addendums that are kind of tacked on to the end of chapters. And then, is in the intros to major years, like 1930, 38, 46. And we get a sense from the tone of this person, who's kind of the meta-narrator, that they have a very different relationship to those years than the Count. They are probably living in the most rugged aspects of Soviet society, and they know its hypocrisies, its indifferences, its violences, and that person kind of begins to weigh in and sort of point to some of the worst things that are going on outside the hotel, both the indignities and the crimes, and so that becomes kind of the balance for me, and I think it works, but that's ultimately up to the reader.
Yeah, it absolutely works. A Gentleman in Moscow is probably going to be my book pick of the year, and it's only halfway through. I love this book so much. But it's been out since September and is enjoying its 29th week on the New York Times bestseller list, and has been trending on the Amazon charts since they started the Amazon charts a month or two ago. Which is really intriguing because it shows not only books that people bought, but books that people are reading, which is a really cool thing to as an author to see that. It's one thing if people buy your book and then put it on a shelf. It's another thing if people buy your book and then read it. What has all of this success and the amount of people that are enjoying your work, what does that do for you as a writer moving forward, do you think?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, it's certainly when you put a lot of effort into a book. It takes me 4 years to write a book. You hope that it's going to find. I like to think I want my book to find its natural reader. I don't need to sell my book or ask somebody to read it who wouldn't like it. I mean, it's not my goal. And I'm not trying to convince anybody, one way or the other. But if there's someone who's a natural reader for my book, you want them to find it, and finding things isn't easy today. And so it is satisfying when you've written something and it begins to its natural reader, and it's a crazy aspect of our times that. You can email me by going to amortowles.com and sending me a note, through the contact page. It comes right to me. And you think hundreds of years, for most novelists, if you wrote something, you wouldn't know what the readership thought or what they liked or what struck them or infuriated them either, I guess. But, so, suddenly you get emails from people around the country and then around the world, who the book struck a personal note for them and they want to talk about why. And that's obviously it's very moving and satisfying as an artist to have the opportunity to hear that response rather than simply, send the book out on a boat and not know where it lands. But in terms of how does it affect the future, I think you just got to go back and pick another topic that you care about it and write it and with little attention to your readership But again, that's very different for genres. I know and respect some great writers in the crime field, and I have great admiration for Hammett, Chandler, and McDonald, and I know Craig Johnson, who created Longmire, and as I say, I've met Lee Childs, who created Jack Reacher, and I think that the way that they have to think a little bit differently about their audience and their book, because it is the character is going to keep recurring, And that's a cool thing. It's a cool relationship that they have with their readership, or their as it ties to the ongoing unfolding of this character's life. And when you're starting with me and where each novel is going to be totally different, it's kind of a different set of rules and a different set of incentives.
Amor Towles, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the show today. I'm going to put a link in the show notes to both of your books. Highly recommend them. We're going to send everybody over to pick them up. You mentioned that people could contact you on your website. What is that website where people can read more about you and get plugged in with your work?
It's amortowles.com. And so it's AMORT as in Tom, OWLES.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hank, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Stay tuned now for a clip from the Jason Crane series by Richard Glebes. There's a link to the entire series in the show notes. As always, tune in every Tuesday and Friday for new episodes of the Author Stories podcast. Find all of the archives at hankgarner.com. Now on to our clip from the Jason Crane series by Richard Gleaves.
They sat in silence, leaning on Spook Rock. It pulsed against his back, in rhythm with his heart. He fought an urge to press his palms to it and steal its mysteries. Kate took her hand away. "This fundraiser for my father's campaign, was it your idea?" "No. I didn't think so. You need to watch out." "For what?" She stood and paced, hands in pockets, avoiding his eyes. "Right now, you're a free agent. Nobody knows what you can do except me and Joey. That's rare. You've got space to find your own path, without everybody watching you or controlling you." "How many of them, us, are there?" "A few handfuls of families. We used to be all over, but we're kind of dying out. The secrecy issue makes it hard for us to find each other, hard to find people to marry and the like. So we congregate in a few obvious places. Salem, Sleepy Hollow." "Transylvania?" "Don't be stupid. There's no monsters, just people. And ghosts." "Ghosts are people." "They were." She held her arms out. "That's all there is. People in the spirit world, and places in between. Magic places, haunted places. Like this. We gravitate to towns where we can stick together." "It sounds nice." "It can be smothering. We have factions. Not all of us want to get by in peace. Some of us, my father is one, say we need to be more aggressive. Increase our numbers, take charge of things. Politics, finance, fix the world. People listen. They think they're special. They don't call themselves the gifted. They call themselves the appointed. As if God singled them out to rule. My dad's a good man. He just thinks he knows what's best for everybody. And you'll be meeting his crowd." "At the fundraiser?" "It will be mixed, mostly normals, but I'll point out the dangerous ones. My father employs a man named Mather. You can't miss him. He has purple eyes. Mather is like this rock. He'll be able to sense you. If you want to stay a free agent, you'll need to avoid him." "Or else what? They'll want to recruit me?" "You're Ichabod's descendant. Ichabod was attacked and survived, a potential founder. They're already watching you." "I'm no good to anyone." "You don't believe that?" "Neither do I." She knelt and pushed the hair out of his eyes. "What am I going to do with you, Jason Crane?" "Love me," he thought. He felt himself lean forward. They would kiss, here in this sacred place, beneath the stars. Stars? Stars? "What time is it?" Jason jumped to his feet. "We need to go." "Why?" A firefly swept the air, flared yellow-green, and died. "What's wrong?" She followed his gaze and gasped. Fireflies swam in every dark crevasse. Faces coalesced where the lights hovered. Faces of crones and young boys and stern men. Emaciated, hale, wounded, vacant, menacing, piteous. Bodies took form. Military uniforms, bonnets, black lace, crepe, shrouds, winding sheets. Sleepy Hollow Cemetery had disgorged its dead, and that grand army of spirits now made camp at Spook Rock to await orders from their leader. A laugh chopped the wood of the forest. Jason had heard that laugh before.